Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Men in Cars, the podcast where we talk about the history of motorsport with or without men. Welcome back, everyone. Episode 11. I do love doing the Women's Week ones, guys. I can't lie. And you guys do seem to like them as well, so that's good. I need to research some more kind of like wider topics for women, because I love doing the individual figures. I do like doing those. But ones like this week's episode or the one on WAGs, those are really fun to do. But anyway, today we are talking about grid girls. And I've seen like a lot of people make content about grid girls, but I never thought to do it, maybe because I thought it wasn't quite history, or there's not very much at all on the history of grid girls. But this all happened in 2018, which is 5 years ago, and that counts as history. If it's a era, a period, or a phenomenon, if you will, that has ended, that counts as history. So here we are. And this kind of makes it easier because all the sources are on the internet. The articles are not written in 1920s talk, which is hard to understand. It's a lot easier. I wonder what you would count as motorsport history. What, timeline? Because at university they tell us that before 2016 is history. But I don't know how you would, enforce or what you would consider. Maybe, pre-hybrid era? So, before 2014? Or kind of, in my mind, any car that doesn't have a halo looks really old, So that's what I count as history. But anyway, yes, today we are talking about grid girls. And what are grid girls, you might ask? That is a very good question. So they were a group of women that were heavily used in race weekends. So they were kind of at the circuits for the races and used for promotional events. They were also used in car reveals at the beginning of the season. So they would do stuff like displaying driver numbers next to their cars, and also kind of parading the pit lane, and were basically used as an aesthetic accompaniment to the event. So that was their general kind of role throughout the history of Formula One, which I will be focusing on today. They are obviously used in a lot of motorsport events throughout the history of Formula One. They've basically held that same role. So the first woman who was kind of labelled a grid girl was a woman called Rosa Okagwa, who appeared in kind of motor races in the late 1960s in Japan, and her role was to represent race winners and again promote the race, make the event what men considered to be more attractive or more aesthetically pleasing, to boost that image of motorsport being full of kind of glitz and glamour, basically. So after that point, this concept kind of gained a lot of popularity, and grid girls then began to hold up the drivers' grid numbers and welcome, cheer the drivers that would finish on a podium. And also I think this kind of goes along with a lot of the reasons why grid girls kept being used after F1 officially kind of banned it, in essence, but they were kind of an unofficial ambassador for the race's hosting country. So I believe these women were kind of hired by the circuits themselves. They weren't hired by Formula One as an organisation, so that kind of gave a bit of leeway when they were not wanting to be used anymore. And I think Formula One, the championship itself had a lot less control, or countries individually could make a lot more excuses as to why they were important. So a lot of people saw them as kind of unofficial ambassadors for the race's hosting countries, which doesn't seem like a bad concept in itself. I think that could have been a reason why maybe the concept of grid girls could have been a lot more long-lasting if they could have, turned it into something positive, something to kind of represent or show off that country's, national identity. But they didn't really take this route. So this brings in the problem, maybe not a problem. Well, it kind of is a problem, but a big part of grid girls was their clothing. So if you look at examples of grid girls, I'll put some in the Instagram post, but they all wore very similar outfits. So they're very kind of scantily clad, showing off a lot of cleavage, often wearing mini skirts. And the fact that in nearly every single country they would wear this same outfit or something to that effect, and throughout history kind of the same thing. It didn't really deviate or like change with the times very much. But by 2018, when people were making pleas to stop grid girls from being present at races, this was a big talking point, because by wearing all the same outfits in every country every year, that really showed that they had really no regard for the country's national dress. So they couldn't really use that excuse of them being like ambassadors for the countries, or there was no like sense of individuality. And as society, you know, developed or tried to halt all these processes that limited the progression of women's rights, this was one of the things that was seemed to be quite limiting, particularly for women in motorsport or who wanted to get into motorsport or who wanted to watch motorsport. It was at the very least like not progressive, which I think every person or organisation should try and aim to do, because obviously it does need to be done. And this was very much like within the rules of being a grid girl within Formula One. So every country had like a set guideline for outfit design. So even if they wanted to, they couldn't really like go their own way. And this led many people or many countries to argue that, you know, F1 created their own downfall in terms of grid girls, because, you know, by giving such rigid rules that made the role of a grid girl very like obviously just a kind of objectifying aesthetic addition to a race. So as I said earlier, you know, when I was researching this or when I thought about this topic before, there wasn't like a lot of deviation in information or any information really at all, apart from kind of like visual sources during like the 20th century or early parts of Formula One or any specific stories. But I think that really speaks to how these women were treated, because they're all just viewed as like this group collective of objects that are just meant to stand there and look pretty and not show any individuality or any flair or any skills aside from boosting the driver's masculinity, which was in effect what they were there to do, kind of the same as I think I talked a bit about that in the episode on WAGs. But yeah, I think that does really show why there hasn't been any coverage of like individual grid girls until like maybe the last 5-10 years that they were in effect. I've seen a couple people on TikTok, I think, have done like their experiences being a grid girl. All have been quite positive. I can imagine if that's what you wanted to do, and, you know, if you were a model or a glamour model, then that would be, you know, a good job to have. But it's about kind of, you know, I'll talk about this a lot in the reasons specifically why they were banned. But yeah, when you take that perspective and look at why this role exists or why it has existed, it's just not justifiable anymore. So now we've talked a bit about what grid girls were, what they did, get right into when they were banned and why they were banned and what people thought about it at the time and what the view is kind of today, which I do find really interesting, because people's opinions on this in 2018, when this first came out, were like really strong, which seems ridiculous today, or to me at least. So at the start of the 2018 season, Formula One released a statement that said that they will be ending the practice of using walk-on grid girls. That would start with that season. And they also stated that those changes do also apply to other motorsport series that would take place the same weekend as the Formula One Grand Prix. So the circumstances under which this change came about was after Liberty Media began owning and operating Formula One, and this was a big step forward, and I think in retrospect a very positive step forward. This came along with the beginning of Drive to Survive on Netflix, so it was, quite a big move in how Formula One was operated in an effort to make it more modern or to widen their audience, because previously, like a lot of motorsport, it just had that view that it was for a very like elite specific audience, that it was like a gentleman's club kind of vibe. But that was really harming the ratings of Formula One. If you look at the statistics of who watched it, it was really not thriving. Like, something needed to be done, essentially. So Liberty Media came into control, and one of the moves they made to modernise Formula One was to reassess that role of grid girls. So they justified it as an effort to make motorsport a more equal and accepting sport again, trying to widen their audience, get those numbers back up again. And a big audience that they wanted to kind of open up to was women or younger people. So obviously, if you're a woman and you don't know much about Formula One or motorsports and you look at it, you think, oh, well, I don't really want to watch that because they've got all these models or women who parade these races in outfits that what I think really cater to what you would call the male gaze. I mean, grid girls were obviously very beautiful women, but their outfits are not. They're a bit ugly, guys. I don't like them. Like, if you're gonna have women there specifically to be aesthetically pleasing, at least put them in aesthetically pleasing outfits. Like, for God's sake, it's not that hard. Anyway. But yeah, women would see the sport and be like, that's clearly not catered for me, so why should I try and watch it? Or if they wanted to maybe be a driver or be in that industry, also doesn't seem that appealing, because being a grid girl was, for most people, seemed the only job or the only role that was really suitable or available for women. Because, if you wanted to be like an engineer, people would be like, oh, why would you bother wasting your time with that? Like, there's this role of a grid girl that's catered just for women, so just like leave the men to the difficult bits and just stand there and look pretty. But obviously that's not good, guys. This kind of perspective was also used in terms of trying to make Formula One more appropriate or more open to younger audiences, or like children or teenagers or whatever. And by having these scantily clad women like very clearly shown in Grand Prix, maybe if you're a parent and your child wants to get into a sport, maybe Formula One wouldn't be on the top of that list if that was something that you thought was an issue. So that all kind of contributed to trying to widen that audience. People also argued, like, what relevance do these women have to motorsport? I mean, like, does the sport really need it? Shouldn't their appeal from men come from a car's not interesting enough to men? Again, is it appropriate? Probably not. It's just a bit unnecessary. And people who also supported getting rid of grid girls also said that they were subject to a lot of objectification, and I would say this is absolutely true. Lots of people, particularly at the time that they were banned, say this isn't the case, but those people are all men. So again, it's pretty obvious by the types of clothes they wear, the jobs or like activities they're made to do and things like that. Like, it's very obvious what their role is, and no one really cares about their individuality or their personality. And again, not really setting the right tone for like women in the industry. But so many people were really strongly against grid girls being banned. Like, they wanted them to stay, like, so badly. Guess what? They're all men. But people said that these women were still like actively involved in motorsport. They were kind of at the forefront visually, and that it was consensual and they were making their livelihood. They signed up to do this, and I don't know exactly how much money they would have made, but if you were an up-and-coming model perhaps, and this would put you on the map, because still a lot of people would watch races or whatever. So people use that as their main argument against this ban. And when I was trying to find more information on this, looked up grid girls on YouTube, and there are so many like daytime TV interviews of so many people, and mostly women actually, doing like TV interviews. And I think obviously they're entitled to their own opinion, but the fact that they're women saying these things to defend the role of grid girls. Kind of, it's quite obvious it's just there to give men's like misogynistic opinions more like, I don't know, to try and like justify them. So lots of people, mostly women who worked as models, saying that, you know, they think it should stay. And even Naomi Campbell was on Good Morning Britain saying she was really like disgusted how it was banned, and that is like insulting to models, that their livelihood is being taken away. And obviously that is really sad. Like, I'm not, if your job is just suddenly like taken away from you and there's no possibility, I mean, that kind of is, but like, you know, I'm not saying that people didn't enjoy it and didn't have fun, but you just have to look at the bigger picture, I suppose. In 2018, I'd say an overwhelming amount of people who publicly spoke about this were really against this ban, like really against it, which seems a bit strange. And countries in particular, like in 2018, I think it was Monaco, Russia, and there was a debate over Austin. So particularly Monaco and Russia still had grid girls in 2018, even though Formula One said they weren't allowed. So in Monaco, the president of the Automobile Club of Monaco said that, you know, they had no problems with Liberty Media except for the grid girl issue. He said they'll be there on the grid, they're pretty, and the cameras will be on them once again. So again, I'm not really sure on how rigid the rules for Formula One were, or how those specific countries or specific circuits could really like deviate from those rules. But Russia, again, also kept them in 2018. But after that, I think on a more like official level, grid girls were not really seen too much. Maybe sporadically. I remember there was an incident, I should probably know this, but I can't remember exactly, but there were grid girls back to some effect. Or maybe it was, you know, one of those things where it was like they're just there to kind of like represent the country's culture. But I think it was Pierre Gasly tweeted like, oh, good to see grid girls are back again, and he got a lot of slack for that. So, you know, I don't think they'll be bringing them back in full effect very soon, or if they did, there'll probably be a lot of backlash. So as I said earlier, the kind of debate over this, or over how sometimes women were, you know, intrinsically linked to a country's culture, was in Austin. So they said that they have a tradition of, you know, the pre-race show that includes the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders, and obviously cheerleaders are a big part of American sports, and obviously sports is a big part of American culture in general. So this is kind of one of those instances where, again, you kind of think what really constitutes a grid girl. I think in the case of cheerleaders, it's probably a bit different. I think, again, if the women who are at these events, their primary job is to be a cheerleader and they are just there to, you know, like represent their country or their city, then that's better. But I think there were cheerleaders at the Miami Grand Prix this year, actually. But again, wearing quite different clothes to what they used to wear, or to what like the specific grid girls used to wear. So obviously when this ban came into effect, a lot of drivers were asked, when they still used to do like proper like press conferences, were asked about their opinion of the ban, which is not really, I don't think they should have been asked, not really their issue. But they were asked, and they all were overwhelmingly in support of them remaining, obviously. So Lewis Hamilton said, I think women are the most beautiful thing in the world. So yeah, he thinks they should be kept, obviously. And then Sebastian Vettel also said, I agree with Lewis. I like women. I think they look beautiful. And then Charles Leclerc also said, pretty much similar to Seb, but I think it was quite positive to have girls on the grid. And a lot of people kind of, held that opinion that it was tradition, and, you know, you're like, it's fine, like, they're fine, you guys are fine, right? So they should stay. But again, it's not really their battle to fight. And I suppose from their view, it would have been great if you just won a race and then there's a beautiful woman to greet you or whatever. But yeah, it's one of that constant like battle between something when a tradition becomes harmful and people are like, oh, but it's a tradition, like, so what? And I don't think any of them were really like firmly or like actively trying to get grid girls back. They just expressed their opinion that they really liked having them there. But still. And Nico Hülkenberg also went as far as to say that it's a step backwards for the sport. Oh my god. And he said it would be a pity if they took the eye candy from the grid. So yeah, a lot of men a bit disappointed. You might go so far as to say upset, but yeah, they'll get used to it. So now let's talk about people who are in favour of the ban and, you know, I suppose how the ban actually came into effect in the first place. So it was largely down to Ellie Norman, who was F1's first female executive. And back in 2018, she gave an interview to the Sunday Times that describes, you know, how she contributed to this ban and how it's seen as like a positive or a very necessary thing to do. So she was the director of marketing and communications. And yeah, with the introduction of Liberty Media and the new kind of social climate in 2018, she saw that grid girls didn't really do that much comparatively and were, yeah, it was a necessary thing to do to get rid of them. Again, as I said earlier, in order to change that perception of the sport and widen their audience, really. So a big part of why this was brought into contention was the repercussions of the Me Too movement in 2018. So this touched like every industry at the time. Was a huge thing, and yeah, F1 was also caught up in those repercussions. So I think this kind of brought that aspect of viewing women in kind of like as a wider collective, or how to best their interests, but people often used, you know, what impact this ban would have on those specific women who are grid girls to argue against this ban. So people were saying that, you know, F1 can't dictate what women want to do or what they want to do with their bodies, and that this was another step in discriminating glamour models. So this was kind of stepped on being a class issue. So glamour models were typically more kind of working class, I believe, and they were arguing that by getting rid of this job opportunity, they were just delegitimizing the role of glamour models and also furthering that privilege for high fashion models that were typically, you know, a lot more opportunities. And I imagine these were, you know, very real concerns, but I think that's, you have to really weigh up the pros and cons, and I think long term, by keeping grid girls, particularly, like, imagine having them today, I think that would have done a lot more damage to opportunities for women overall. And yeah, it's just one of those things, you just have to weigh those consequences up, really. So overall, it was deemed that, again, the sport did not look appealing to new female audiences of Formula One, and it would also be quite a barrier for women who were aiming to work in motorsport in other areas that weren't for promotion. So yeah, it kind of finished with that, and yeah, they were banned. So I think, as I said before, similar concept to grid girls have, you know, cropped up at a few Grand Prix, but you know, the sentiment behind their role at those races are quite different, and the fact that they're not at every single race obviously does make a difference. And I've noticed a few other categories of motorsport have had girls that kind of seem to be extremely similar to the role of a grid girl in kind of like MotoGP and other smaller categories, but you know, I don't think they're quite labelled, or they're not kind of like publicised or put at the forefront of races as they were perhaps used to be. So, you know, like grid girls as a thing in Formula One are pretty much finished. And again, I find it so interesting by today's, or like from the perspective of 2023, that people were so like ardently against this ban. So like, I imagine if people tried to argue for bringing grid girls back today, that would be met with a lot more hostility, obviously, like as it should, but it seems like such a left field argument to make, or something that would be very unlikely to actually be enforced, or would be very difficult to be enforced. So it is really fascinating to see how people are really against it, and it does kind of follow the pattern of when something is banned or when something's taken away, people instantly want it back because it's scary that Formula One wasn't the same as it was last season, and people don't like change. And I think it's probably more to do with that, but because you can see it like every time there's like a new rule change, a new something introduced, people are instantly like against it at the time, but a few years later, in retrospect, think it's a really good idea. I know this is a strange comparison, but I think the introduction of the halo was quite a similar reaction. at the time people were really against it and thought it was stupid and a waste and taking away the essence of Formula One, but years later it's now an essential thing and people are like, oh, thank God we have it. It's a similar thing to that. In retrospect, you think, oh, was it really that much of a leap, or is it really that bad that grid girls are gone? Probably not. So that is all I have for this week's episode. I hope you have enjoyed. Follow on Instagram, TikTok. I hope I can find, I say literally every week, I hope I can find clips. Last week I couldn't find any, so I don't want to put out terrible clips. But I'm sure I'll find some this week. I'm sure there'll be some. And also, again, follow 5 stars on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Also subscribe on YouTube if you watch on there. And yeah, I'll see you next week. Again, can't remember off the top of my head what it is, so I suppose it'll be a nice surprise. Anyway, see you then. Bye.